This is the Lumix S1Rii Mark II, and I'm wondering, is it actually a Sony Slayer? Is it the A1 Mark II for literally half the cost?
The one thing is though, it's electronic shutter only for that.
Let's find out. Quick disclosure, because that's important. I was flown out to Lumix's Norway event to check this camera out before it launched. I was provided a sample review unit of the camera, but Lumix isn't paying me. They do not get to see this video at all before you guys do. And I'm not even putting a sponsor in this video because I just want to go buck wild on this review. However, I did develop a new LUT for Lumix cameras, specifically Mayfam 3. So if you do feel like supporting, you can check out my digital products on my website or get them all for free if you become a member of my Patreon. Now that that's out of the way, let's dive into the S1Rii Mark II, because it's pretty freaking crazy. The S1Rii Mark II is a full frame, high resolution, truly hybrid camera that genuinely feels like a big step forward for Lumix in this competitive high resolution 8K hybrid camera market. How much money is this little thing gonna run you? Well, for the body alone, it's $3,300 USD. And Lumix as a company claims that this is great for anyone from skilled amateurs to professional photographers, professional content creators, professional filmmakers. We'll see. And I know a lot of you get upset when I hold the camera like this. You can turn on a setting that allows the cover to shut when you turn off the camera. So I'll do that for now. Just kidding, I do what I want. Let's keep going. Ergonomics. This camera is somehow slightly more compact than the original S1Rii that nobody used. Okay, I'm sure a lot of people used it, but anyway, I have no idea how they crammed all of the features that I'm gonna go over into a camera this compact, but the camera body does feel amazing. It's actually very similar size to the GH7 that I reviewed last week, but it doesn't have the sloped top of the body. It's nice and flat on top. There are some key differences we'll get into as well. I genuinely just love how the camera grip feels on the S1Rii II. Everything from the buttons, dials, materials, it feels like Panasonic's highest build quality yet in a mirrorless camera, except for the shutter button, ironically, which is kind of a big deal. It feels kind of cheapy and like there's not enough resistance when you're half pressing it, if that makes sense. Totally a nitpick for sure, but something I noticed. The turn on time is also basically instant. The top of the body does have locking dials, which is very much appreciated on each side, as well as on the back, it has that same locking switch that the GH7 has. I got made fun of for my GH7 review where I complain about the front record button, but I literally hit this thing so much when I'm not trying to, especially when I'm in photography mode. I end up with random clips like this.
Why?
This shutter cover is made of carbon fiber. The camera body does have a built-in fan for cooling, but I'm not gonna do overheating tests because it's cold in my basement studio and even colder outside. Another dial I really like on this camera on the back is the focus switch to go from manual to continuous to single focus. It has a nice amount of resistance so you don't accidentally bump it. Is the autofocus better than Sony and Canon? We better find out. Now, there's one other switch on this camera body that essentially makes this camera a true hybrid. It's this little switch underneath the left dial to switch between photography, video, and S&Q. What's amazing about this switch is when you go from photo to video back and forth, it completely separates and retains the settings from each side of the camera, which for me personally is incredible and makes it actually feel like a true hybrid camera because it's still compact, but it has so much capability in both photography and filmmaking. So I love that it feels like two camera bodies crammed into one, and all it takes to switch between them is one little switch. But my favorite feature on the body of this camera is, of course, the nipple selector. I'm telling you guys, nips on all cams, including this one. And of course, it's the Lumix way to make basically every single button on the camera customizable, programmable, so you can set up your camera however is most efficient for you. The electronic viewfinder is 5.76 million dots at up to 120 frames per second refresh rate. We love this, awesome. I also really like the circular design here. It's kind of Nikon-esque and just, it makes me want the GoPro. And guys, the screen design on this camera is the greatest on any mirrorless camera ever made. This screen flips out, rotates, bring her back in, Not only does she also tilt, she pops out, dude. It's also OLED and you can crank the brightness to shoot outside, which is great if you're out in bright sunny conditions. Obviously, this camera has an L mount. It also has 2 card slots. One is CF Express Type B and one is SD. But also, if you do want to rig this out for filmmaking, it can record to external SSDs. Although you don't really need to do that because you can shoot internal Apple ProRes and all this kind of stuff. But anyway, you can record to SSDs if you want. For ports, you get a full-size HDMI, you get USB-C with power delivery, but one thing this USB-C port can do that I love is you can plug this directly into your computer and then just transfer your files from your SD card or your CF Express Type B card directly to your computer or your hard drive. You also get a headphone jack, a mic jack, and a hot shoe for external audio in 32-bit float recording, just like the GH7. As I said in my GH7 review, the Lumix menus are basically eternal, never ending, but you can narrow that down into a personal menu. And like I said in the GH7 video, make your My List setting of frame rates and resolutions that you like to record in most. It'll save you so much time changing camera settings in video. So the sensor is 44 megapixels. We all like biggie number, but on a real note, I really like that this sensor is not a super high resolution like 60, 70, 80 megapixels, because 44 is a nice sweet spot where it's very high resolution, but it's not gonna absolutely chew through hard drive space. So how about the photography performance of this little bad boy?
All right, ready?
Yep.
And go.
It gives you up to 40 frames per second, blackout free with autofocus on.
I think, oh, it's still writing that to the card,
Oh,
but you
okay.
can still shoot.
Interesting.
That is
Good to
interesting.
know.
Yeah, it's blackout free, so I could like see you in focus the whole time. The one thing is though, it's electronic shutter only for that. Let's try this, that's dog poop. Sick!
But when you're shooting mechanical shutter, if you want that full 14-bit RAW, you get up to 9 frames per second. And if you want 12-bit RAW, you can get up to 10 frames per second. So it's a lot less with your mechanical shutter, but it's good to know. There are some cool new features that I probably won't use, but I figured I'd mention. There's a 177 megapixel high resolution mode that takes 8 shots and it can work handheld and just merge them together. Pretty insane. There's also a cool built-in multi-exposure mode where you can take one photo and then overlay another one on top of it for some really creative compositions and artistic looking fun shots. And I shot with my own LUTs baked into this camera, walking around Norway, getting absolutely crystal clear, beautiful 44 megapixel photos that were already pre-graded with my own LUTs. And it's just so much fun to shoot that way for me personally. One thing I'm bummed about though, is they did not bring the LUT button from the S9 over to this camera. I was kind of thinking like, oh, Panasonic's cameras moving forward are gonna have a little LUT button just dedicated to baking in LUTs and settings and styles. But they didn't include it on the back of this camera. It kind of makes me sad. I thought that was gonna be your thing, Lumix. I programmed my AF on button to be my real-time LUT button, which is in a very similar position to the S9. One thing I've noticed is if you want to bake grain into your photos via JPEG and the internal noise and grain settings, you kind of have to crank it higher on this camera because it's such a high resolution sensor. Grain can kind of fade into the background a little bit more. Just experiment with that and have fun. But now let's take our little hybrid switch and move over to...
You say you don't know where you go, so come.
This is awesome.
The wind in your hair, birds keep flying away, away, away. Ooh, lost in your world. Ooh, memories of home. Ooh, lost in your world.
I gotta start off this section of the video with one feature and one feature only, and that's false color. This camera has internal false color, which is my favorite way to expose my footage quickly. I programmed false color to be on this little button right here so I can quickly tap it, get exposure, tap it to turn it off and start recording, but you can do it however you want. I just love that they put it in this camera. Now for codecs, resolutions, and frame rates, this camera has so many. You can do 8.1K internal, 17:9 up to 30 FPS, 5.9K up to 60 frames per second, Cinema 4K up to 120 frames per second, full frame open gate 3x2 footage up to 6.4K. Also, we were told in a firmware update that 8K open gate is coming. And also raw output is coming to compatible Atomos and Blackmagic recorders as well. But internally, you can already record MP4 Lite, MP4, which I'll probably never use either of those two, but .mov has like all of the options available, which I will be using mostly, and then also internal ProRes and then internal ProRes RAW. You can record internal proxies already to sync up to your HQ footage to make editing a little smoother, but I will say I'm on a base M2 Mac Mini still, and I can edit the 8K footage in 24 frames per second perfectly fine. Now, when I slap my power grade on it that has noise reduction and all this other stuff, then it gets bogged down for sure, but I can still usually edit graded footage at a quarter quality, and even in 8K, I can do that on my M2. It's not perfect by any means, but it doesn't chug like crazy. And I'm gonna be honest with you guys, the way I like to shoot, I don't think I'll ever go above shooting in .mov on this camera. It genuinely has so much beautiful information, so much flexibility with exposure and color. I'm good to go. I have every option available to me and the footage looks pristine. Not trying to be an absolute glazer here, but this camera has more than I would ever need. The spec sheet says you get 14 stops of dynamic range in Vlog, but there's one setting on this camera that affects that a little bit. There's a weird setting on the S1R2 that I have mixed opinions on, and that's dynamic range expansion. Basically what the setting does is when you turn dynamic range expansion on, it obviously expands or gives you more dynamic range at the trade-off of losing a ton of frame rate options, and you get worse readout speeds, so worse rolling shutter performance.
Okay, so now we're gonna do a DR expansion test outside. We don't have a ton of dynamic range to work with because it's so cloudy here in Indiana. We have DR expansion turned off right now, which means our base ISO is 200 and we're exposed right at 0. So this is what it looks like. With expansion on, our base ISO is 400, so we're still exposed at 0. I just cranked the ND a little bit. So it's the exact same exposure, same exact conditions. Now let's test rolling shutter, because when expansion is on, you technically get a little bit worse rolling shutter according to the specs. Again, when are you gonna be filming like this, you know? Unless you're filming like race cars driving by, I guess,
yeah, right.
Like really high action stuff. So now expansion's back off, so we're at 200 ISO. So this should be a little bit better rolling shutter performance.
So all in all, if you want the best dynamic range, you turn DR expansion on, and then you get better dynamic range with a little worse rolling shutter and a dual native ISO of 400 and 2000. If you want better rolling shutter, you turn DR expansion off, so you get about a stop worse dynamic range, a little bit better rolling shutter, and then your dual native ISO is a little lower at 200 and 1000. I know that's complicated. I tried to communicate it the best that I could, but that's how this camera works. But another thing about the ISO that I was surprised about is the low light. I was actually able to get really good looking shots around like the 5,000 to 6,400 range. But even when I cranked up to around the 10,000 to 12,800, the footage looks pretty dang good. Yes, there's some noise, specifically chroma noise, but with a little bit of noise reduction in Resolve, I was able to get really good looking footage. I think because this camera's sensor is so high resolution, it makes all the noise look way more fine like grain, so it's not super big, blocky, and gross. It's pretty pleasing overall, and you can shoot up into those higher ISOs with pretty good performance as long as you're exposing well.
Let's just see how good this IBIS is if I'm being really careful.
All right.
Okay, let's go. Filming a real estate video.
I'm walking and talking about this beautiful house.
I don't know how often I would do this in the real world, but let's just push it. So we're at 50 mil.
50 mil. We're talking about this wonderful backyard. A lot of dog poop goes in here.
Where it falls apart a little bit is when you're walking, obviously, like that's the biggest IBIS struggle, right? In the corners of the image on this camera, you will see a little bit of warping. Definitely not that bad by any means, But if you don't want any warping, you gotta be really careful with what kind of movements you're using, but that's just a good practice in general with any camera.
In reality, guys, like if I was using IBIS in a real world situation, it would be for like, here, Joe, come over here. It would be for shots where I'm like, dang, that autofocus is locked on, by the way. Really? Yeah, but I would just do these like subtle little like fake slider shots, stuff like this. Get some foreground element and then just do like a slow push in. As long as I'm not like taking big clunky steps, like that should look pretty dang good, I imagine. Just stuff like this. That's where IBIS shines, in my opinion. So I'm thinking you're gonna be, oh, there's poop, dude. So much poop because the snow melted.
Oh, poops.
We're in Cinema 4K, 24 frames per second.
And go. Locked. Now back up.
Once they updated the firmware, it is locked on.
Really?
Yeah, do that one more time.
Locked.
Now back up.
Locked. Oh my gosh, it's actually,
Still?
it's good. It's dialed.
Panasonic has been really fast with firmware updates behind the scenes. This is like the second firmware update already, and the autofocus is like locked in right now. It's doing a really good job whether subject detection is on or off, and it's the whole zone of the sensor. So theoretically, like, you should be good in pretty much any situation. We're shooting on the newest Sigma 24-70, the second version. L-mount, I mean, dialed in right now.
Support on Patreon to get access to all my digital assets, past and future, get your name on the videos like these folks, and entry into monthly gear giveaway live streams. Join the Discord server for some nerdy tech friends, and remember that you guys are loved much more than you might even know. Seriously, thanks for watching this crazy video. It's been a lot of work, and really appreciate you guys, and God bless you guys. We'll see you in the next one. Whew.